The young woman you're looking at is named Zilka, and while this was being filmed, she was at the center of one of the most unbelievable hostage crises in recent history. Journalists were asking the perpetrators to pose with her so that they could get the perfect picture for news outlets, all while the police did nothing. In this video, I'm going to be discussing a series of disturbing things from around the world, with a focus on cases that aren't as well known, because that's what I do. So, I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first. The two 18-year-old girls you're looking at are named Zilka Bischoff and Ines Voigtler, and on August 17, 1988, they both boarded a city bus in Bremen, Germany. Zilka was just a few weeks shy of her 19th birthday. She was training to become a legal secretary at the Bremen District Court, and Ines was training to be a saleswoman at a pet shop. These two girls had been best friends since they were 7 years old, and this evening, after the trip, they were planning to have just a cozy night in where they watched a horror movie together. Zilka went out of her way to switch trains just to surprise Ines. Another person who was on this bus at the exact same time was a 14-year-old boy named Emanuele. He was born in Italy on Christmas Day in 1973, and his family had come to Germany as guest workers from a small town in southern Italy. Alongside him was his 9-year-old sister, who he was very protective of, Tatiana, and his parents. But what was about to happen on this city bus was absolutely unbelievable. This story involves a 54-hour hostage crisis that stretched across multiple German states and into the Netherlands, a media circus so outrageous that it fundamentally changed journalism ethics across the world, and dozens of decisions made by many adults that would ultimately cost innocent people their lives. Now, before we get back to that city bus, I need to introduce you to two men, Hans-Jürgen Rösner and Dieter Degovsky. Rösner was 31, he had a very difficult childhood at the hands of his father, and in total he had spent 11 years of his life in prison for assault, theft, and robbery. Degovsky was 32, he had an IQ of 79, and was addicted to alcohol and sedatives. And I'm just going to get this out of the way early, I don't speak German, so I do apologize if anything is pronounced poorly, but I am trying my best to figure out pronunciation. These two had known each other since way back when they attended the same special education school in Gladbeck, and both had since become career criminals. By 1983, they actually ended up sharing a prison cell together, and so they reconnected. Both of these men would eventually be released, and in August of 1988, they had come up with a plan to commit a robbery together. And on the morning of Tuesday, August 16, 1988, at around 7:55 a.m., Rösner and Degovsky broke into a Deutsche Bank in Gladbeck right before the place opened for business, carrying multiple pistols and something like 350 rounds of ammunition stuffed in a plastic bag. At gunpoint, they forced the employees to hand over 120,000 Deutschmarks, and at first the plan was simple, they'd just grab the cash and get out. But like with many armed robberies, things are not always that simple. It turns out that at 8:04 a.m., a doctor who had his practice in the building above the bank saw this happening and called the police. He'd watched the two men break in. And right away, the cops who responded made quite an error. They parked their squad car directly in front of the bank's main entrance, so when Rösner and Degovsky tried to walk out with their money, the first thing they saw was a police cruiser sitting right there. So they immediately just turned around, went back inside, and grabbed two female bank employees as hostages. From here, what should have just been a 10-minute robbery ended up becoming a 14-hour standoff. At this point, the media started inserting themselves into the situation. This really began with a journalist named Hans. He called the bank and ended up getting Rösner on the phone for an interview. All of this while he was still in there holding people at gunpoint. You have to remember, this is a very high-stakes situation, and this should not have happened. Negotiations dragged on for hours, and eventually the bank's branch director, a guy named Wolfgang, ended up serving as sort of a middleman for police and the robbers, and eventually the cops agreed to meet their demands. They ended up handing over 300,000 marks and a getaway car to these robbers, with the cop who delivered it being made to strip down to his underwear when he gave it to them. The getaway car was a white Audi, and police had rigged it with tracking devices and hidden microphones so they could monitor everywhere the robbers went. And at 9:45 p.m., 14 hours after this whole thing started, Rösner and Degovsky finally drove off with the two bank clerks still held hostage in the back seat. And in case you're wondering, yes, the cops basically just let them go. The officer who was running this standoff later admitted that he figured the whole situation would, quote, resolve itself overnight. He genuinely believed that they'd have Rösner in custody by morning because the guy had so many tattoos and was, in his words, not exactly a criminal mastermind. But of course, this confidence turned out to be catastrophically wrong, and again, you just let these men drive off with 2 hostages in the car being held at gunpoint. Shortly after leaving Gladbeck, they picked up Rusner's girlfriend, a woman named Marion. She was 34 and she joined them willingly, bringing along a backup pistol. The 3 of them, along with their 2 terrified hostages, drove erratically through the night, heading through multiple cities, of course being followed in the process. At a gas station, they mugged a police officer and stole his service weapon and radio, which meant they could now monitor police communications. By the early hours of August 17th, they'd made their way to Bremen with the bank clerk still in their custody, and by afternoon, Rusner and his girlfriend left the car to go shopping while Degovsky stayed behind to guard the hostages. Degovsky himself left the vehicle to use the bathroom, leaving his weapon sitting on the center console with the hostages right there. Officers were positioned just 250 meters away with dozens of tactical personnel on standby, but they did nothing. Command never authorized an intervention. The men returned, drove off, and then eventually ended up at a bus stop at around 7 p.m., still in Bremen. Here, they noticed that police surveillance was still following them around, and this made them increasingly more paranoid, so they panicked. Rather than trying to flee in their car, they approached a city bus that had just pulled up to the stop. Line 53 was carrying 32 passengers, 5 children including Emanuele and his 9-year-old sister, Tatiana, and the 2 best friends, Zilka and Ines, who I mentioned before had just been planning a quiet night to watch movies. Within minutes, Rusner and Degovsky had taken over the bus at gunpoint, and by this point, journalists were everywhere. They didn't cover this story from a distance. They descended on the scene and inserted themselves directly into the crisis. We could tell that police had absolutely no handle on this. Reporters literally conducted live interviews with the armed hostage takers while terrified passengers sat behind them. The media presence grew so dense that it essentially created a human shield around the criminals, which made police intervention even more impossible. While on this bus, Degovsky immediately took a particular interest in Zilka Bischoff. He told her directly early on that he was going to be taking her with him. And Ines thought this whole thing was some sort of bad practical joke, but that feeling ended when she realized how serious they were. They eventually did release some of the older hostages and the original bus driver, but it wasn't over yet. From here, the bus departed with 27 hostages still aboard, heading south on the Autobahn before stopping at another service area. And some really nasty crap happened here too. At some point, Degovsky would step outside of the bus with Zilka, giving interviews while pressing his firearm against her chin and throat, and the media, again, just let this happen. In fact, it seems they wanted it. Rusner, from that point, stated explicitly that he only wanted to communicate through the media. The journalist had really just become a source of protection. While the media circus continued at this rest stop, police made another catastrophic decision. 2 officers arrested Marion when she left the bus to use the washer. And when Rusner discovered that his girlfriend had been taken, he and Degovsky issued an ultimatum. Return her within 5 minutes, or they would start killing hostages. Officers scrambled to comply, but just everything went wrong. Like, for example, a handcuff key broke while trying to free her. And one officer had turned off his radio, causing critical communication delays. When this 5-minute deadline expired and Marion still hadn't been returned, Degovsky moved to grab a hostage. It was sometime around this point that 14-year-old Emanuele stepped forward, positioning himself between the gunman and his little sister, Tatiana. He was protecting her. Tragically, Degovsky fired at him at point-blank range in the head. Marion returned to the bus approximately a minute after this fatal shot. Some sources even say 20 seconds. That's how close it was. Unbelievably, no ambulance had been stationed at the scene, despite the obvious danger of the situation. Medical help didn't arrive until bystanders called emergency services. That's right, police did not call them, and this was roughly 20 minutes later. Emanuele was transported to Bremen Hospital, where he passed away in the early hours of August 18th. He was 14 years old, and he passed away protecting his 9-year-old sister. At some point, the bus continued on its journey, eventually crossing into the Netherlands at 2:28 a.m. on August 18th, and there the Dutch authorities had taken quite a different approach than their German counterparts had. Armed Dutch police stopped most of the press vehicles at the border, refusing to let the media circus continue on their soil. They established tight perimeters and refused to negotiate as long as children were being held hostage, and at 5:15 a.m., the women and children still on the bus were released. At 6:30 a.m., negotiations produced another getaway car, a BMW 735i that had been prepared by police with tracking devices and a remote engine kill switch. Of course, the plan was that officers could disable the vehicle whenever they needed to, but according to reports, they forgot to bring the remote control. In the process of them going to this vehicle, all remaining hostages from the bus were released, except two, Zilka and Ines. They were specifically chosen by the hostage takers to remain. And as I mentioned, it seems that Degovsky had gained interest in Zilka from early on, so if he was going to pick any two people, it sadly had to be them. The group crossed back into Germany in this BMW and spent the morning driving south. They went on another shopping spree, and at some point, the BMW stopped directly in front of the regional broadcasting headquarters. Within minutes, dozens more journalists and curious shoppers surrounded the vehicle. Zilka and Ines sat in the back seat with firearms pointed at them, while reporters fought for position outside the windows. More attempted operations by police were in process at this point, but they also failed. Journalists continued to surround the car while the two girls were still in the back seat, with Zilka having a firearm still pointed at her, asking her things like, "How are you doing with the gun to your throat?" But the most egregious thing here from a journalist came from a man named Udo Robel, a deputy editor-in-chief for a big newspaper. After offering the hostage takers coffee and conducting an interview with them, Udo offered to get in the car with them and guide them to the Autobahn. He got in and he rode with them to a rest stop before finally getting out. He later claimed that he acted out of compassion to prevent a bloodbath, but critics pointed out that he complicated any rescue attempt. I think that's pretty obvious here. The final confrontation of this entire thing came on the afternoon of August 18th at approximately 1:35 p.m. On the A3 Autobahn, police finally decided to act. They gave the order to arrest the perpetrators, with the lives of the hostages being, in their words, quote, "a risk to accept." An armored police car rammed the BMW and rendered it immobile, and because the car had accelerated seconds before impact, it wasn't tipped to the side as officers had intended. Degovsky was knocked unconscious in the crash, Marion ducked down into the legroom of the passenger seat, and Rusner, lying prone across the front seats, exchanged fire with tactical officers who were surrounding the car. Over approximately 5 minutes, 62 shots were fired at the vehicle. In the back seat, Zilka Bischoff screamed at her best friend, "Jump out, jump out, jump out." She just wanted her best friend since 7 years old to survive this. The screams were so intense that it was almost as though Zilka had a premonition that something terrible was about to happen to her. Ines did manage to open the door and throw herself into a ditch. She was struck in the back by a police ricochet, but she did survive. Zilka, unfortunately, did not make it out of this alive. At approximately 1:40 p.m. on August 18th, 18-year-old Zilka Bischoff was shot through the heart. Forensic analysis confirmed that the fatal shot did come from Rusner's weapon, but he has denied shooting her intentionally and has even claimed it was actually the police who fired the fatal shot. The court ultimately could not determine whether he pulled the trigger deliberately or reflexively after being wounded himself. This 54-hour crisis was finally over. Emanuele and Zilka did not make it through this, and another police officer was killed too. I couldn't find much about it, but he apparently passed away in some sort of traffic accident pretty early in the chase. As you can imagine, in the aftermath of this incident, people were infuriated, and it did bring some accountability, but not nearly enough. The German Press Council issued new guidelines within weeks, declaring that interviews with hostage takers during ongoing events must never occur. The case became mandatory study in journalism schools across Europe, with the head of the German Journalists Association calling it the darkest hour of German journalism since World War II. Accountability for individuals involved was very limited. Udo Robel just rose higher in his career, and many other journalists involved went on to have prominent careers as well. Bremen's interior minister resigned in November 1988 over the police failures, but that was about it. Rusner received life imprisonment plus preventative detention and remains incarcerated today in his late 60s, having never formally apologized to the victims' families. He said he didn't apologize because he believed it wouldn't be enough. Degovsky also received life imprisonment but was released in February 2018 after nearly 30 years and now lives under a new identity. Marion was sentenced to 9 years, served 6, and was released in 1995. Ines survived, but the trauma never left her, and even though I don't speak German, watching some of these interviews, you can just tell. She's spoken publicly about suffering from depression for years afterward, about how her marriage fell apart, how the images and smells from those days still haunt her, and she said that gunshots still ring in her ears. She also described feeling like butcher cattle during the crisis, like they were dehumanized spectacles for media rather than human beings in life-threatening danger. She's also said that police never apologized to her, and she's never forgiven herself for convincing Zilka to take that bus. And even more heartbreaking, Ines initially thought that Zilka had made it through. The morning after the final confrontation, police came to pick her up for questioning, and she asked how Zilka was doing. The officer told her bluntly, she's dead. She thought her best friend had survived this until the next morning. A memorial now stands at the Bremen bus station bearing the names of those who passed away, and at kilometer 38 on the A3 motorway, a tree and cross mark the spot where Zilka Bischoff took her last breath. On her tombstone next to her name and the dates of her birth and death, there are only 3 words: our dearest and why. Emanuele was 14, and he passed away protecting his sister because a handcuff key broke and an officer turned off his radio. 25,000 people attended his funeral back in Italy. The Gladbeck hostage crisis is remembered as quite a turning point in Germany. It was a moment when the media and the police both failed so catastrophically that I couldn't even read my script without stopping 1,000 times and just asking, why? Rest in peace to those who lost their lives in this devastating and completely preventable tragedy. So you may have heard of this incident. It made some headlines, but not too many, and the case actually just came to an end, so we can now cover it in full. I am going to keep the individual identities private at their request, but I just genuinely believe there's some things that can be learned here, and it is quite frankly unbelievable. It begins with a 32-year-old man from Florida. On the evening of September 17th, 2025, he was at Universal's brand new Epic Universe theme park in Orlando with his girlfriend, and he was about to ride one of their highly anticipated flagship coasters. One important detail to consider about this man is that he had been born with spinal cord atrophy affecting his T2 through T5 vertebrae, a condition that had weakened his lower body muscles over time and of course required him to use a wheelchair. That evening, he and his girlfriend made their way over to this crazy ride, Stardust Racers, which is a dual-track coaster built by German manufacturer Mach Rides that reaches speeds of 62 miles per hour and heights of 133 feet. The ride has tons of steep drops, a lot of different rapid acceleration points, and a signature element called the Celestial Spin, where both tracks crisscross while they're inverted. It looks absolutely insane. Now, because he was in a wheelchair, park staff had to help transfer him to the ride seat using a lateral transfer device. It's pretty standard accommodation at these sorts of theme parks. And once he was seated, an attendant came to secure his lap bar. But according to his girlfriend, the restraint wouldn't lock on the first attempt, and a staff member had to push it down 2 or 3 times before the safety indicator turned green. So already off to a sketchy start, but this stuff does happen. In fact, it's happened to me before. Now, it's worth understanding what kind of restraint system Stardust Racers uses. Like many Mach Rides coasters around the world, it has lap bars only, with no over-the-shoulder harnesses. The system works by pressing down across your thighs, and riders typically brace themselves using their legs and core muscles during the more intense moments. Remember, this is strength that because of his condition, he did not have. He had weakened lower body muscles and no use of his legs. But regardless, he was on there, nobody stopped him, and at around 8:56 p.m., the coaster launched. Security footage reviewed by investigators would later show that he appeared engaged and in good spirits as the ride departed the station. But what happens next is just absolutely horrible, and it comes primarily from his girlfriend, who was seated next to him. As the coaster went over the first hill and began its descent, she witnessed him fly forward before striking the metal bar that was positioned in front of them. And this was not a single impact. She described watching him continually hitting his head as the coaster ran through its course. And despite her attempts to hold him back, she just could not stop what was happening. She screamed for help, but of course, no one could hear over the noise of this ride. And when the coaster returned at 8:58, the man was slumped over and completely unresponsive. There happened to be a physician nearby named Anna Marshall who was waiting in line and jumped a fence to help after hearing the girlfriend screaming. She recalls finding no pulse and observed that his femur was resting against the back of his seat. A Universal paramedic reported that it took approximately 10 minutes to release his lap bar, which had become jammed. He was eventually transported to Orlando Health Regional Medical Center, where he was pronounced deceased at 10:05 that night. He was just 32 years old. In the aftermath, multiple investigations were triggered. The Orange County Sheriff's Office looked into whether any criminal conduct had occurred on the ride, and a lot of people from early reports found this suspicious because at that point we didn't know that he had the condition that he had. The Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services sent an inspector to examine the ride, and Universal shut down Stardust Racers and began their own internal review. Nearly 3 months later, on December 11, 2025, the Sheriff's Office released its final report, concluding that his death was accidental with no criminal acts identified. Investigators also determined that Epic Universe employees had followed their standard operating procedures. And the next day, the medical examiner released autopsy findings, ruling the cause of death as multiple blunt impact injuries. There was a fractured orbital ridge, a broken nose, a laceration to the disc between his C5 and C6 vertebrae, causing hemorrhaging around his spinal cord, and again, that fractured right femur. And Universal maintained throughout this process that the ride functioned exactly as designed. The company president, Karen Irwin, said staff followed proper procedures, the equipment was intact, and the ride systems operated as intended. I also read that this assessment was validated by Mock Rides, another independent engineering expert, and state officials. It appears the answer here just seems to lie in the physics of the situation. A lap bar keeps you in your seat by pressing against your thighs, but your upper body remains free to move, so riders instinctively brace themselves using their legs and core muscles to resist the forces during the drops and inversions. Because this man's lower body muscles were atrophied from his condition, when the coaster dropped, there was nothing anchoring his torso and he pitched forward into the metal bar repeatedly throughout this ride. And naturally, this is where opinions diverge pretty sharply. Some point to Universal's responsibility, arguing that the park should have cleared restrictions or given better screening for guests with conditions. Others argue that this man and his girlfriend made a conscious choice to board an intense roller coaster despite his physical limitations, and that personal responsibility has to factor in somewhere. But I'll let you make up your own mind on this. When Stardust Racers reopened on October 4th after being closed for about 2.5 weeks, Universal did implement changes. Most notably, a new policy now requires guests who use wheelchairs or mobility devices to walk independently in order to board. There were also updated warning signs. Also, I think there's some other details that are worth noting. When journalists filed public records requests with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, asking for documentation from the state inspector's examination, the agency responded that there were no responsive records, meaning that no written reports were produced, despite the inspector reportedly spending 15 hours over 4 days examining the ride. Another interesting thing is that Florida's largest theme parks are exempt from state safety inspections under state law and conduct their own internal reviews instead. On December 13, 2025, the man's family announced that they had reached an amicable agreement with Universal. The terms were never disclosed. Rest in peace to this man, and no matter where you stand on this, it is good that it got settled and this is now closed. The woman at the center of this story is named Sandy, and in 2020, at 68 years old, Sandy was living in one of the more isolated towns on Earth, Esperance. It sits on the remote southeastern coast of Western Australia, roughly 700 kilometers from Perth, and it's surrounded by basically nothing other than bushland and ocean. And really, we're just going to jump right into the story. We don't know the exact date in 2020 that this happened. We don't know what she was doing on this day beforehand, for reasons that will be made clear. But what we do know is that at some point when she was going about her day, while her and her husband were at home, Sandy accidentally went over the railing of her second-story balcony and fell straight down onto the cement driveway below. The impact of the driveway cracked her cranium, dislocated her right arm, and caused her brain to begin hemorrhaging while she lay completely unconscious. Her husband was inside the house with no idea that anything was wrong, and in a place so remote, it was highly unlikely that anyone was going to be checking on her. In the minutes after the fall, Sandy just laid there, unresponsive. A brain hemorrhage of the kind that she had sustained does not wait. Without intervention, the pressure builds up and the damage spreads. By every reasonable measure, this is where the story should have ended. But then something quite unbelievable happened. She began to wake up. She was drawn to consciousness by two sensations that she would never forget. A soft purring sound very close to her face, and something small tapping continually against her forehead. When she did manage to open her eyes, she saw a magpie standing directly over her, as if it was desperately trying to wake her up. This tapping from the bird continued until Sandy was alert enough to cry out for her husband, who finally heard her from inside the house and immediately called emergency services. Paramedics eventually arrived and rushed her to a heliport, where she was airlifted to Royal Perth Hospital and stabilized. When the medical team assessed her injuries, they said if she had remained unconscious on that driveway for much longer, she almost certainly would not have survived. This magpie, who really she barely recognized in her dazed state, had just saved her life. And this alone is absolutely amazing, but there's a bit more to this, and once you hear it, I think you're going to be amazed. See, in 2017, so 3 years prior, someone brought Sandy a tiny magpie that had been found helpless on the ground after falling from its own nest. The bird just could not fly, and it would have passed away without intervention, but Sandy was exactly the person who was equipped to help. She'd spent her entire life caring for injured and orphaned wildlife. Not as a profession or anything, it was just a deeply personal calling that consumed her time, and she asked for nothing in return. It was just the satisfaction of watching animals recover that compelled her to do this. Her connection to wildlife actually began before she could even speak. Sandy grew up in Papua New Guinea in the 1950s, and as an infant, she had shared her crib with baby sugar gliders, small birds, and even young crocodiles that needed warmth. Being around this so early sent her down a path that always included volunteer animal care, and by the time she took in this injured magpie decades and decades later, she had already rehabilitated countless creatures and knew exactly what to do. She named the bird Jellybean and spent months nursing her back to health until she was strong enough to fly and forage on her own again. Eventually, Sandy would release Jellybean back into the wild, and she expected the usual to happen. It would disappear into the wild and she'd never see it again. But Jellybean did not leave. She made Sandy's property and the nearby area her territory and came back constantly, perching up on the veranda and tapping on the door with her beak until Sandy came outside to greet her. She even played with Sandy's young grandson when he colored. Jellybean, as you can probably guess, was the magpie that was tapping on Sandy's head when she fell off that 2-story balcony in 2020. Sandy saved Jellybean's life in 2017, and 3 years later, Jellybean saved Sandy's life. Doctors were pretty adamant in the fact that if Sandy had not regained consciousness in time, the hemorrhaging and swelling would have continued and she would have either suffered permanent damage or lost her life. But of course, this entire situation made her realize that living in such a remote place at that age probably isn't a good idea for much longer, so she eventually relocated. Sadly, this meant that she had to say goodbye to the property where a lot of birds had come to know her, and it meant leaving Jellybean behind. She says this is one of the most difficult choices she ever had to make, but she did find some comfort knowing that she had raised a magpie to be independent and capable of caring for herself. This one's absolutely incredible, and I'm very glad to hear that she's okay. The idea of a woman spending so many years of her life doing this out of the goodness of her heart, to have it eventually save her life, you can't make it up.